not all of you, but a couple of you probably are in the same age era that I am. And when you look back through the past, there's been some historical events that impact your life. Everybody has that. In probably my time period, maybe one of the first things that those of us would bring to mind was when President Kennedy was assassinated. That was huge, really, really huge stuff. And there were other things like the walking on the moon and some other stuff that was pretty big, but the Challenger explosion was kind of a significant time, too, that changed people's mindsets. And then 9/11 definitely impacted, changed the view of the world, and really does a lot to you. The people in my generation during the 60s, as they were being impacted by culture and other stuff, began to lose interest, especially in the status quo. That's probably something that we're really known for. There was a musical that was put out in the late 70s that the opening song had a phrase in it that said something like this: "Let's throw away conventionality belongs to yesterday." Conventionality belongs to yesterday. We really, my grouping, tried to throw away traditions, tried to throw away the values of what we saw. Some of you here lived through other events even prior to that, like World War II. We have some that served in that. And then the economic boom that happened after that. If you're younger than that, probably the major event, younger than me and the really young ones, probably the two big major events that impacted your life were the Cavs won and Pokemon Go. But anyhow, those things impact us. There's no doubt that we are affected by what happens around us and how our other culture views all that. Daniel lived at a very, very significant time, and he had to have been impacted somewhat by the culture that was around him. As a very young man, probably in his middle or late teens, he was taken hostage and transported miles, many, many miles away to another land that was totally new and strange to him. Through that process, he was tested and selected to be part of the royal service and actually becomes a key advisor to the king of the land. And remember, the king, a guy named Nebuchadnezzar, is probably one of the top 5. That's a sports thing. Everything's top 5, top 10. He's probably one of the top 5 all-time greatest rulers in the world. I mean, this guy was huge. You were having trouble imagining how big and how powerful this guy was. And Daniel served as his advisor on many levels. Today we're in Daniel chapter 5, so we're now several assassinations later. Very tragic story. Remember in Daniel chapter 2 that there was this vision of a statue, and at the very top was a head of gold, and the statue eventually tumbles. We're going to see the head of gold tumble today. By the way, there's the event that happens today is so amazing. I mean, this is just something you and I can't even dream up. It's so unimaginable. And yet there are archaeological finds that do confirm that this actually took place, because there's lots of people, like someone named Xenophon, who carved in and told some of the details of what happens here. It's not just a scriptural thing. Well, I'm not going to go through how this happened as far as the genealogy goes, but the main character, King Belshazzar, is basically, through the family line, he is a grandson, probably by adoption, to King Nebuchadnezzar. So this is a little while later. Actually, from chapter 4, where we were at 2 weeks ago, to chapter 5, where we're at today, is about 23 years takes place So there's family, there's in-laws, there's all these different people who raise up into the significance of the rulership over Babylon. And so grandson Belshazzar was like people today. He was devoted to every god except for the one true God. Now that's strange because the last thing we said 2 weeks ago was that Grandpa, King Nebuchadnezzar, gave this beautiful testimony at the end of his life after all that he had been through of committing himself to the one true God, Jehovah God, Israel's God. And he gave an incredible accounts of that and statement of God's greatness. And now here's a grandson that is going after every god there is except for that one. So when we come to chapter 5, he's ordered this national holiday. It's like the Sleepwalker on steroids. It's huge. It's really big. But while this holiday is taking place and they're partying and having fun and reveling, and the enemy has surrounded this town, the city, and the fortress, and is ready to come knocking at the door. So, one of the questions I'd like to ask is why? What's going on? Why did he throw a party of such magnitude when the enemy is right outside the door? Well, there's a couple reasons I'm going to suggest to you, I think. There you go. There's one of them. He wanted to put the people at ease, to reassure them. Yeah, the enemy's outside, they're pounding on the door, but it's no big deal. There's no problem. We have supplies inside. We could last for years. They're not going to starve us out. Don't worry about it. We're here to enjoy ourselves because we're the big bad dudes on the block. Or maybe another one was he was trying to show them outside that we're boss. You don't scare me. We're fine. We can come out there and punch you in the nose if we want to. Or maybe the other thing was they're just celebrating the great Babylonian gods. Maybe that's what they were doing. Well, all of a sudden, right when everybody was drunk, something unimaginable happens. A man's hand appears out of thin air. It's just a hand that's there, not an arm, no body connected to it. A hand shows up and begins to write on the wall. And King Belshazzar's color drains from his face when this happens. He's frightened. Eventually invites a Hebrew captive named Daniel to come in and interpret the foreign words on the plaster, and then the king trembles even more. And when the writing on the wall comes true, that very night, Darius the Mede, waiting outside, takes over the throne of Babylon. King Belshazzar, the grandson of the great king Nebuchadnezzar, faced death because of his pride. So, let's go back and take a look at what really was going on. Look at how he was living in the lap of luxury. This was a pleasure-seeking, self-absorbed man. And yet Daniel somehow is still faithful to the kingdom, still serving, some suggest, as prime minister. He wasn't there at the time, but Abraham Lincoln once said, "You cannot escape the responsibility of tomorrow by evading it today." Boy, I wish our politicians knew that. That would be nice. Just because you pretend it's not there doesn't mean that there isn't a threat outside the doors. So first we're going to look at that pursuit of pleasure. I'll read verses 1 through 4. It says, King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. And as they drank the wine, they praised the gods, small g, of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Come to my party, is what he said. Everybody's going to be there. Thousands of the leaders that are under me are all going to be there. This is a banquet I'm going to throw for the false gods that we worship. Or maybe it's just to worship him. Don't think of it as impossible for him to throw a party that would entertain 1,000 or more people. Alexander the Great, not real long later, used to throw them routinely for 10,000 nobles that he would always do. Well, anyhow, all these people that were present became drunk and they became reckless. And Belshazzar was probably the most in that. This act that he did, bringing in the temple vessels to drink out of and to give praise to false gods, was an act of high sacrilege. Why? Why would he do such a thing? Well, maybe to defy the God of Israel. Remember part of that Daniel 2 prophecy, the head of gold's going to crumble and fall? He's maybe trying to prove to God and defy God that you're wrong. This isn't going to happen. I'm going to still be ruler. I'm going to take over everything. He wanted to show his superiority. Not like what his grandfather had experienced when his grandfather was greatly humbled. Someone suggested he should have been fasting, not feasting. Well, in chapter 2, in point 2, presence of God, in verse 5, I'm going to read down a little bit, maybe to about, verse 12. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in that royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. The king called out for the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners to be brought and said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and the nobles, came into the banquet hall. By the way, this queen is probably the wife of Nebuchadnezzar, his grandmother. I'll tell you about her later. "O king, live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. This is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father," that's the way they talked back then. Everybody's your father in your line. "Your father, the king, and I say, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. This man Daniel, whom the king called Belshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." So the blasphemy of Belshazzar did not go unnoticed by God. Right when the banquet was at its very height and the tomfoolery was at its pinnacle, a hand and fingers appear on the wall. And the response by Belshazzar is that he's absolutely perplexed. He is frightened to death. You can see and feel the shock in him. He sobered up pretty quick. His face was red with wine, and then it went white like a ghost all of a sudden. I can just picture the orchestra stops playing, and all the revelers become silent as this strange, mysterious thing happens. Somehow the gods have interrupted the celebration. And there's this mysterious message written on the wall, and whoever can interpret it is going to receive an amazing amount of gifts and rewards offered to them. But the other advisors, all those trickery people, come in, and they were absolutely useless. They either could not or would not interpret what it meant. It was a message from God, and it required a man of God. So I mentioned about the queen. This is probably Amytas, Nebuchadnezzar's wife, who comes in. She would have known history. The reason why we think that is because Belshazzar's father was deceased. His wife was off the scene. There was just a lot of information that none of the others would have been around, and most people think it was Amytas. So I thought, wouldn't this make a great commercial when it absolutely, positively has to get interpreted today? Call Daniel. I think it's perfect. So apologies to the Air Force. I'm sorry. Isn't it strange? Daniel is still high up in the hierarchy, and yet this guy doesn't seem to know about him, or at least he doesn't refer to him and call him. Why? And it really, I get the impression, I think Belshazzar is a pretty ignorant guy almost all the time. So self-absorbed, and all he cares about is all he cares about. So, reading on from verse 13, it says, So Daniel is brought before the king, and the king says to him, Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I've heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered the king, Keep your gifts for yourself, and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king, and I will tell him what it means. O king, the most high God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the peoples and nations and men of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from his people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself. Though you knew all this, instead you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives, your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze and iron, wood and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. Daniel's a man of probably about 80 years old or more at this time. And he was able to look back and understand the entire story. He knew that it wasn't going to be very much longer that Israel was going to finally be given its release. So he sees this coming to a climatic end. And he knows that the message that is given is one of demise. It tells us that the other ones they could not understand or maybe didn't want to interpret, but it was quite interesting. The words that are given, I have here for you. Yeah, there you go. That's one. We'll give you the second one, too. No, this is real. This is actually happening. I didn't do that. Well, you know I didn't do that. David did it. But anyhow, those words, that's an English transliteration. That's not how they appear. You know, my computer doesn't have Hebrew on it, so we couldn't do that. But those words, in fact, the first word, which looks like mene, when you pronounce Hebrew words, you hear people do it preachers do it all the time. There's a lot of guttural stuff in there, a lot of spitting going on. No, I'm not going to do that for you. But that first word is actually repeated twice in there. And they have definitions that go with them. The first word just basically means numbering. It's numbered. And the second word would mean that it's been weighed. And then the third one has to do with dividing, to divide. Why was that so hard for them to understand? It has to do with numbered, weighed, divided. Hard to understand. Actually, that third word that's listed there probably has a vowel in front of it that most English Bibles don't put in there, and that would make it a plural thing. So anyhow, it's basically a message that says you have been numbered, your days are numbered, you have been judged, it's been weighed, you've been counted, and your kingdom is going to be divided into several portions. By the way, that last word there is in the past tense too, which probably means that your city has already fallen. Well, he's sitting there in the heart of his throne thinking, I'm fine. But what he doesn't know is that it has fallen, and the executioners are actually on their way right now to carry out their duty on you. Remind you that in 1 Samuel it says, the Lord is a God of knowledge, and with him actions are weighed. God does know what's going on. Even today, he still knows what's going on. He knows the hearts of people. He knows what the actions of people are and what those actions represent from the heart. And God does weigh those and does bring judgment. One of the questions I would have had would have been, why couldn't they interpret that? Why didn't they understand what was being said on the wall? There's a message there. Well, I'll give you a couple reasons just to defend them a little bit. For one, it's in Aramaic. And so they probably don't know Aramaic. So that's, can you read Russian or Chinese? And maybe you can. That's good. Another reason is because in the Aramaic Hebrew system, they only write consonants. They don't write vowels. In the Bible, in the Old Testament, there's no vowels around it. So you only know what it's talking about by the context of the sentence or whatever, and that can tell you. And if you put an A instead of an E in there, it changes the meaning of the word. So they just had individual words. There was no subject listed. There was nothing there. So it would have been a little bit hard. He needed more than just to see those letters on the wall, and of course God gave it to him. Did you notice that when the king calls him in and says, I'll do all this kind of stuff, do you see his response? I tried to bring it out. I'm sure I couldn't do it as well as he did. It was like, keep your stuff. That's useless to me. I don't see the same level of compassion toward Belshazzar as what he had toward Nebuchadnezzar. Now, he didn't have as much time with him either, but maybe he also sensed the heart of rebellion against God and the unrepentedness that was there. Anyhow, he refused his gifts. You know, Belshazzar, don't you know anything about history? Don't you know what your grandfather went through? He even had to remind him of how he was driven out to live with the animals. And you wonder, why doesn't he get it? Here's something that C.S. Lewis said. It is hard to have patience with people who say, there's no death, or death doesn't matter, because there is death, and whatever is matters, and whatever happens has consequences, and it and they are irrevocable and irreversible. I don't know what was going on in Belshazzar's mind, but he could say, my grandfather, I know what he did and what he went through, and I heard all the praise that he gave to God. It's all over the palace and carved in all kinds of different places, but it doesn't matter. I don't care about that. It doesn't touch me. Well, things do touch people, and they do change things. And they happen, so they have consequences, and some things are irrevocable. Some things are irreversible. So here's a question. Did King Belshazzar then believe this great message that was given to him? Well, I don't think he did. I don't think it touched him. I don't think it did anything to him, because he's guilty of at least 3 sins going on here. Number 1 would be he despised the light. Even though he had lifetime of testimony in front of him, people like Daniel and all those others, friends of his, and although he saw what happened to his grandfather, and he had all these things shouting what God has done, he still despised that and ignored it and went the wrong direction. He desecrated the vessels. That seemed, I don't know this for sure, but it just seems like that was the last straw to God. It's like, you know what? I've listened to your insults. I've seen you defy me. I've seen you go the wrong way. That's enough. That's enough. Don't do that. And he defied Jehovah all along. He was weighed and found unbalanced, and he failed. That begs the question of, how do we measure up? Are you knowing and trusting God? The king still didn't take any of this as real. From all we know, he didn't react, he didn't repent, he didn't do any of the things God wanted him to do. You have to beware about ignoring and closing your eyes to the light that God gives of the truth of his word. Don't trust in yourself. This king went into this room thinking, I've got over 20 years worth of supplies that can keep us going for a long time. These walls are thick. They were so thick that they said that chariots could be 4 abreast and ride around the top of these walls. You're not going to get a chisel and go through that. And as far as the real key thing, water supply, well, we have a direction of the branch of the Euphrates coming right through the palace. So I've got all the water I will ever need to survive. They can't touch us. However, what God allowed and what he did not know was that the enemy had dammed up the river, diverting the water to a lake, and then, cleverly, their army of the Medes and the Persians came through those channels right into the palace. They came walking through on that muddy water and got there. Well, listen to verse 30 and 31. It says, that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Pretty young guy. So while the banquet's rocking and everybody's having a great time, the enemy's armies are swarming, and they're walking down this muddy riverbed underneath the walls, bent on blood and destruction. And Darius the general waited and then pounced. Herodotus, one of the historians, wrote back then and said that even the watchmen were drunk. They just were so cocky and sure of themselves. The entire city was living a fool's paradise. So as Daniel said the words, the enemy comes pounding on the gate, inside the walls. 60 years earlier, Daniel prophesied specifically about the Medes and the Persians taking over. The king was killed and the great kingdoms divided. Oh man, the connection between his sin and his fall is absolutely inescapable. I'm suggesting that a thesis of the entire book of Daniel, one thing that we can definitely take with us in every single incident that happens, is that God is at work in human affairs. He really is. He's there. He understands. He is in control. He's a part of everything that goes on. Anyone who sees beyond the visible to the invisible will find a God who provides strength and support. We all live for an audience of one. Daniel's desire was to please God, and he was not about to be defiled. He made that commitment as a teenager, and he stayed true to it. It took courage, but God's presence with him brought that strength. And Daniel's courage helped him to have long-term results in what he was able to do in serving throughout life. We're going to pray together. Let's do that. Father, it's so intriguing to read such a story about other people and other lands, but the truth is the power and the presence that you have there is very equal to what you do and can do in our lives as well. We are equally accountable for how we live with the light that you have given to us through your word. We are accountable to you as our God, to live for you, to trust you, to know you, to serve you, to honor and obey you. And God, you have asked us in our lives to just place you on the throne and allow you to rule. Thank you so much for your love and your grace, your patience with us, your forgiveness that you show toward us. God, we want to open our hearts to you so that you could search and just try us and be sure that we are close to you and doing what serves and honors you the most. God, we pray that in the days ahead, you will find us faithful and that we will be able to do and say and think the things that really are pleasing in your sight. We ask that for the glory of our Savior, Jesus Christ. In his name, amen.